it goes without saying that anything that happens in the United States has an enormous impact on the rest of the world, last election, for example, and conversely, that's important to remember. What happens in the rest of the world cannot fail to have an important, in fact, decisive, crucial often, impact in the United States. And that happens in several ways. For one thing, it sets constraints on what even the most powerful state can do. But in a more significant way, what happens elsewhere, like here, influences the domestic component of what the New York Times ruefully described as the second superpower, namely world public opinion, after the enormous protests against right before the Iraq invasion. And those protests were a critically important historical event. We should not forget why. First of all, their scale was quite unprecedented, but also it was the first time in hundreds of years of the history of Europe and its North American offshoots that a war was protested, and in fact massively protested, before it was officially launched. And that's a historic event, and it tells us a lot about where we've come, and should be encouraging, not depressing. Take, say, by comparison, the war, what's called the Vietnam War, actually the war against South Vietnam, that was launched by John F. Kennedy in 1962. It was brutal and barbaric from the outset. Began with bombing of unprotected civilian targets, chemical warfare to destroy food crops so as to starve out the civilian support for the indigenous resistance, programs to drive millions of people to virtual concentration camps or urban slums to eliminate the popular base for the resistance. By the time protests reached a substantial scale, 1967, the highly respected and quite hawkish Vietnam specialist and military historian Bernard Fall wondered, quoting him, whether Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity would escape extinction as the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. It was particularly South Vietnam, which was always the main target of the U.S. assault. And when protest finally did develop, many years too late, it was mostly directed against the peripheral crimes, the extension of the war to the north and the rest of Indochina. These were terrible crimes, but lesser ones. And it's quite important to remember how much the world has changed since then through deeply committed popular struggle. And the state managers are well aware of it. When a new president comes in, first thing he has done is an intelligence assessment. The intelligence community, as it's called, gives an assessment of the world situation. And George Bush, #1, he did it too. So in 1989, there was an assessment of the world situation, and a piece of it leaked. Usually we don't hear about these things for like 40 years, if ever. But a little part of it leaked and was published. It was kind of hushed up. And it was an interesting part. Somebody obviously in the Pentagon or CIA or somewhere didn't like it and leaked it to the press. It was a discussion of the kinds of wars that the U.S. would be fighting. Wars against what it called much weaker enemies. Those are the only kind of wars you fight, if you have any sense. Wars against much weaker enemies, it said, in the case of such wars, the United States would have to win them rapidly and decisively, because there simply is no political support for anything more than that. It's not like the 60s, when you could go on for years and years with no protest and destroy a country before it significantly develops. Well, that's significant. I mean, the world is a pretty awful place, and you can look at it and get pretty depressed, but it's far better than it was yesterday. And that's not only with regard to the unwillingness to tolerate aggression, but also in innumerable other ways, many of which we now just take for granted. which is good. We should take it for granted, but we should also remember that not many years ago it wasn't like that. Well, there are very important lessons, and they should always be foremost in our mind. If we had a little more time, I had intended to say a couple of words about Canada's role in the Indochina Wars, which is pretty interesting, but I'll skip that. I'll say I'm being polite. But you should know about it if you don't already. It's pretty ugly. Well, without forgetting the very significant progress towards more civilized societies, which has taken place in the past years, and crucially the reasons for it, namely popular engagement and struggle, let's focus nevertheless on the present and on the topic that was suggested for this evening, the notions of imperial sovereignty that are now being crafted. It's not surprising that as the population becomes more civilized, power systems become more extreme in their efforts to control the great beast, as the founding fathers of U.S. society called the people, the hated and feared people. The conceptions of popular sovereignty that are being crafted by the radical statist reactionaries of the Bush administration are in fact so extreme that they've drawn unprecedented criticism in the most sober and respected establishment circles. Actually, it's pretty helpful to people like me. Instead of quoting, sort of far out types, you can quote the most respectable mainstream journals, and they're saying more, stronger things than you might have said yourself. The administration's ideas of presidential sovereignty were transmitted to the president by the newly appointed Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales. At that time, he was the president's counsel, and he's depicted now as a moderate in the press. His views on this are discussed by the very respected constitutional law professor, Sanford Levinson, in the current issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You can't get more respectable than that. Levinson writes that the conception being crafted by the Justice Department, transmitted by Gonzales, is based on the principle that, quoting, "there exists no norm that is applicable to chaos." And that quote, as Levinson comments, is from Carl Schmitt, who was the leading German philosopher of law during the Nazi period. Levinson describes him as the true eminence grise of the Bush administration. The administration, advised by Gonzales, has, quoting Levinson, has articulated a view of presidential authority that is all too close to the power that Schmitt was willing to accord his own Führer. One rarely hears words like that from the heart of the establishment. The same issue of that super respectable journal has an article by two leading strategic analysts on what's called the transformation of the military. It's another component of the new doctrines of imperial sovereignty that are being crafted. That's the rapid expansion of offensive weaponry, including the militarization of space, in this case joined apparently by Canada, and other measures that are designed to place the entire world at risk of instant annihilation. And these have elicited the anticipated reactions by potential targets, Russia and China, who are developing their own offensive weaponry in order to overwhelm it. These two analysts conclude that the U.S. programs may lead to, in their words, ultimate doom. And they express their hope that a coalition of peace-loving nations will coalesce as a counter to U.S. militarism and aggressiveness, a coalition led by China. We've come to a pretty pass when such sentiments are voiced in sober and respectable circles, which aren't given to hyperbole, and when their faith in U.S. democracy is so slight that they look to China to save us from marching towards ultimate doom. And it's up to the second superpower to decide whether that contempt for the great beast is warranted. Well, going back to Gonzales, the President's counsel then, he transmitted to the President the conclusion of the Justice Department that the President has the authority to rescind the Geneva Conventions. It's the supreme law of the land under the U.S. Constitution and the foundation of modern international humanitarian law. And Gonzales advised the President that this would be a good idea. In his words, it substantially reduces the threat of domestic criminal prosecution of administration officials under the War Crimes Act of 1996, which carries the death penalty for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. So he better rescind them quickly. Well, we can see right on today's front pages why the Justice Department was right to be concerned that the President and his advisors might be subject to the death penalty under the laws passed by the Republican Congress in 1996, and of course under the principles of Nuremberg, if anyone took them seriously. 2 weeks ago, on the front page of the New York Times, prominently displayed, was a picture of Fallujah General Hospital. The accompanying story said, patients and hospital employees were rushed out of rooms by armed soldiers and ordered to sit or lie on the floor while troops tied their hands behind their backs. And that's what the picture shows, armed soldiers standing over people lying, patients and doctors lying on the floor with their hands tied behind their backs. And that's described in the stories, in the front page stories, an important achievement. Quote, New York Times, it shut down a propaganda weapon for the militants. Fallujah General Hospital had been producing a stream of reports of civilian casualties, and these inflated figures, I mean inflated because our leader so declares, were inflaming opinion throughout the country. Fixed establishments and mobile medical units of the medical service may in no circumstances be attacked and shall at all times be respected and protected by parties to the conflict. So page 1 of the world's leading newspaper is cheerfully depicting war crimes for which the political leadership could be sentenced to death under U.S. law. No wonder that the Attorney General warned the President, as his counsel, that he should use the constitutional authority that the Justice Department concocted to rescind the supreme law of the land, adopting the concept of presidential sovereignty devised by Hitler's primary legal advisor, the true eminence grise of the Bush administration, according to a distinguished conservative authority on constitutional law, writing in perhaps the most respectable and sober journal in the country. Well, the world's greatest newspaper also tells us, quoted, that the U.S. military achieved nearly all their objectives in Fallujah well ahead of schedule, leaving much of the city in smoking ruins. But it was not, I'm quoting it, but it was not a complete success. Why? There was little evidence of dead pack rats in their warrens or the streets. Those are their words, not mine. They did find a body of a dead woman, although it's not known whether she was an Iraqi or a foreigner. That's the only question that's raised, and apparently the only one that comes to mind. This is all right in the front pages of the world's greatest newspaper. The front page account also quotes a Marine commander who says, it ought to go down in the history books. Perhaps it should. If so, we know very well on what page of history it'll go down and who will be right beside it, along with those who praise it or, for that matter, even tolerate it. One might at least mention the counterparts that immediately come to mind, like, for example, the Russian destruction of Grozny 10 years ago. It's a city of about the same size. Or Srebrenica, which is almost universally described as genocide in the West. In that case, as we know in detail from an extensive Dutch government report and other sources, this Muslim enclave in Serb territory, which was very lightly protected, was being used as a base for attacks against Serb villages. And when the anticipated reaction took place, it was horrendous. The Serbs drove out all but military-age men and then moved in to kill them. That's familiar. It's Fallujah, basically, but there are some differences. Women and children were not bombed out of Srebrenica, as in the Fallujah case, but they were trucked out. And there will be no extensive efforts, we can be sure of that, to exhume the last possible corpse of the pack rats and their warrens in Fallujah. And there are other differences which are arguably unfair to the Serbs. Well, it could be argued that all this is irrelevant. The Nuremberg Tribunal, spelling out the UN Charter, declared that, quoting it, initiation of a war of aggression is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole, hence the war crimes in Fallujah, Abu Ghraib, and so on. Those judged to have played any role in the supreme crime, for example, the German foreign minister, were sentenced to death by hanging. And the Tokyo Tribunal was far more severe. That is an important book on this topic. If you haven't read it, you should, by the Canadian international lawyer Michael Mandell, who reviews in, unfortunately, convincing detail how the powerful have become self-immunized from international law. In fact, the Nuremberg Tribunal itself established this principle of self-immunity. To bring the Nazi criminals to justice, it was necessary to devise definitions of war crime and crime against humanity that hadn't existed precisely in international law. And how this was done is explained candidly by Telford Taylor, who was the chief counsel for the prosecution at Nuremberg and a distinguished international lawyer and historian. So I'll quote him. Since both sides in World War II had played the terrible game of urban destruction, the Allies far more successfully, there was no basis for criminal charges against Germans or Japanese, and in fact, no such charges were brought. Aerial bombardment had been used so extensively and ruthlessly on the Allied side as well as the Axis side that neither at Nuremberg nor Tokyo was the issue made a part of the trials. So in other words, it goes on like this, the operative definition of crime is crime that you committed and we did not. And to underscore that fact, Nazi war criminals were absolved if the defense could show that their U.S. counterparts carried out the same crimes. Taylor concludes from this that to punish the foe, especially the vanquished foe, for conduct in which the enforcer nation has engaged would be so grossly inequitable as to discredit the laws themselves, which is correct, but the operative definition also discredits the laws themselves, along with all subsequent tribunals which follow the same principle. Taylor provides this background as part of his explanation of why U.S. bombing in Vietnam was not a war crime, and his argument is plausible, further discrediting the laws themselves. Some of the subsequent tribunals are discredited in perhaps even more extreme ways, such as the Yugoslavia versus NATO case, which is now being adjudicated by the International Court of Justice, World Court. The U.S. was excused correctly on the basis of the argument that it is not subject to the jurisdiction of the court in this case. The reason is that when the United States signed the Genocide Convention, which is at issue here, the U.S. finally did sign it after 40 years, it signed it with a reservation saying that it is inapplicable to the United States. And the rules of the World Court say that they can only deal with something if both sides are subjected to its jurisdiction. There was an outraged comment on the efforts of the Justice Department lawyers to demonstrate that the president has the right to authorize torture, a comment by the dean of Yale Law School, Howard Koh, and he said that the notion that the president has the constitutional power to permit torture is like saying that he has the constitutional power to commit genocide. Well, the president's legal advisors, like the new Attorney General, should have little difficulty arguing that the president indeed does have that power if the second superpower, it's us, permits him to exercise it. Let's look at the pretext for the U.S.-British aggression in Iraq, the supreme international crime that encompasses everything that follows. The pretext was the right of what's called anticipatory self-defense. Now it's sometimes called preemptive war, in a radical perversion of that concept. This right of anticipatory self-defense was proclaimed officially in the Bush administration National Security Strategy of September 2002, which declared Washington's right to resort to force to eliminate any potential challenge to its global dominance, any potential threat, if you like. The National Security Strategy was very widely criticized among the foreign policy elite right away. It was an article within weeks in the main establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, which warned that what it called the new imperial grand strategy could be very dangerous for the United States. And the criticism continued, again at a completely unprecedented level, right in the core of the mainstream, but on very narrow grounds. It was not that the doctrine was wrong, but rather its style and manner of implementation. Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, she summed up the criticism pretty accurately, also in Foreign Affairs, it's main establishment journal. She pointed out that every president has such a doctrine, but keeps it in his back pocket. And it's simply foolish to smash people in the face with it and to implement it in a manner that's going to infuriate even allies. That's threatening to U.S. interests and therefore wrong. Albright knew, of course, that Clinton had a similar doctrine. The Clinton doctrine, I'll quote it, advocated unilateral use of military power to defend vital interests, such as ensuring uninhibited access to key markets, energy supplies, and strategic resources. That's without even the pretexts that Bush and Blair devised. You take it literally, the Clinton doctrine is more expansive than Bush's national security strategy. But unlike the Bush strategy, the more expansive Clinton doctrine was barely even reported. In fact, I'm not sure it was reported at all, and not criticized. And the reason is it was presented with the right style and implemented less brazenly. That's the way you should do it if you're looking for a career in diplomacy. Henry Kissinger described the Bush doctrine as, in his words, revolutionary. He pointed out that it undermines the 17th Westphalian system of international order and sovereignty, and of course he didn't even bother mentioning it. It undermines the UN Charter and current international law. Kissinger approved of the doctrine, but with reservations, the usual reservations about style and tactics, and with a crucial qualification. He said, it cannot be a universal principle available to every nation. Rather, the right of aggression must be reserved to the United States, perhaps delegated to chosen clients. So we must forcefully reject the principle of universality, the principle that we apply to ourselves, the same standards we apply to others, more stringent ones if we're serious. Bush and Blair, who we're told read the Gospels religiously all the time, must know the famous definition of the hypocrite in the Gospels, repeated a couple of times, but maybe it didn't get from the eyes to what lies behind or whatever. And Kissinger, I think, is to be praised as often for his honesty in very forthrightly articulating the prevailing doctrines, which are usually concealed in professions of virtuous intent and tortured legalisms. And Kissinger also understands his educated audience. As he doubtless expected, there was no reaction. Well, his understanding of his audience was illustrated again rather dramatically just a couple of months ago, last May don't know if it's reported here, some Kissinger-Nixon tapes were released over Kissinger's strong objections. And there was a report in the world's leading journal, New York Times. The report mentioned in passing the orders to bomb Cambodia that Kissinger transmitted from Nixon to the military commanders. In his word, a massive bombing campaign in Cambodia, anything that flies on anything that moves. You get that? Anything that flies on anything that moves. Well, I think that's unique in the archival record. At least I never come across a call for genocide in such explicit terms. The publication, we'd certainly call it genocide if anybody else were responsible. And this is a call for it. The publication elicited no reaction. That incidentally refutes Dean Coe of the Yale Law School. It is simply taken for granted in the elite intellectual culture that the president and his national security advisor do have the right to order genocide, contrary to Coe's outraged claim. Well, just imagine if the prosecutors at the Miloševic tribunal could find anything even remotely similar. They'd be overjoyed. Trial would be over, several life sentences, death penalty if it adhered to U.S. law. But remember, that's them, not us. And the difference is a core principle of the elite intellectual culture in the West, and in fact, throughout history rather generally, if you look. The principle of universality is the most elementary of moral truisms. It's the foundation of just war theory and, in fact, of every system of morality, which is why it is repeated over and over again in the Gospels. Rejection of moral truisms is a fundamental principle of intellectual culture, so deeply rooted as to be invisible. And just to illustrate again how deeply entrenched it is, that's the world in which we live, incidentally. It's not some exotic thing on Mars. Let's return to the principle of anticipatory self-defense, which is adopted as legitimate by both political organizations in the United States and across virtually the entire spectrum of articulate opinion, those usual margins. The principle has some immediate corollaries. So if the United States is granted the right of anticipatory self-defense against terror, then certainly Cuba, Nicaragua, in fact, a long host of others, have been entitled for years to carry out terrorist acts within the United States, because there's no doubt about U.S. involvement in very serious terrorist attacks against them, extensively documented in impeccable sources. In the case of Nicaragua, even condemned by the World Court and the Security Council in 2 resolutions that the U.S. vetoed, with Britain loyally abstaining. The conclusion that Cuba and Nicaragua, among many others, have long had the right to carry out terrorist atrocities in the U.S. That conclusion is, of course, utterly outrageous and advocated by no one. And thanks to our own self-determined immunity from moral truisms, there's no fear that anyone will draw the outrageous conclusions that follow from our doctrines. And there are actually still more outrageous ones. So I don't know anyone, for example, who goes out in the streets every December 7th to celebrate Pearl Harbor Day by applauding the fascist leaders of Imperial Japan. But by our standards, it's exactly what we should be doing. The bombing of military bases in the U.S. colonies of Hawaii and the Philippines was entirely legitimate and praiseworthy, according to our standards. The Japanese leaders knew very well that B-17 flying fortresses were coming off the Boeing production lines, and they were surely reading the U.S. press and very familiar with the very public discussions in the United States at the time, explaining how these planes could be used to incinerate Japan's wooden cities in what was called a war of extermination, flying from Hawaiian and Philippine bases. And that's a far more powerful justification for anticipatory self-defense than anything conjured up by Bush and Blair and their associates and supporters. Well, fortunately, we're once again protected from such conclusions by the principled rejection of elementary moral truisms. It's very easy to continue, but too easy, in fact, so I won't go on with some other examples I was going to go into. But all of this, cite examples at length. It's hard to find an exception. It does leave open a crucial question. How does the great beast react? That is the domestic U.S. counterpart of the second superpower. Well, there's a conventional answer. That is that the population approves of all of this, as was just shown again by the election of George Bush, leading to, 150,000 people trying to come north. But they're misunderstanding what happened. And as is often the case, a closer look is helpful. So let's take a slightly closer look. The winning candidate last November received about 31% of the eligible vote, the loser 29%. The results were very close to what they had been in the year 2000, virtually the same red and blue states, as they're called. A few percentage shift in the vote, which is almost a random event, would have meant that Kerry had won, also telling us nothing about the country and the electorate. The reason is that issues of substance were very consciously kept out of the campaign. You have to remember that political campaigns are designed by the same industries that sell toothpaste and cars and so on. It's not an exaggeration. They're run by the public relations industry. What is their professional concern and their regular vocation? Well, it's not to provide information. Their goal, rather, is deceit. And that's not a secret. Every time you turn on the tube, you see it. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year are spent in what's called advertising, which does not, say, list the properties of next year's cars, as would happen in an unimaginable market society based on what you study in economics courses, informed consumer choice. That's a total myth. Just take a look at the advertising. It tells you why. The point is not to present information, it's to deceive you. That's why the car, like GM doesn't tell you, here's what I'm going to produce next year. It takes, 1 minute, no money. What it does is show the car with a, sexy model in it, or a sports hero, or, doing some ridiculous thing like climbing up a sheer cliff or something like that. And it's the point is, and it's true of the whole hundreds of billions of dollars, is to project some kind of an image that might deceive the consumer into buying this car instead of the virtually identical one produced by a competitor. That's the prime commitment of the public relations industry, and one of the many ways of undermining the mythology about markets, which nobody believes in unless you can force them on someone else. And the same is true with elections, which are run by the PR industry. The goal is to project images and to deceive the public into accepting them while sidelining issues for very good reasons, to which I'll come back. And the population knows it. Not stupid. About 10% of voters say their choice is based on the candidates, reading the polling question, on the candidates' agendas, ideas, platforms, and goals. That's 6% of Kerry voters and 13% of Bush voters, otherwise essentially nobody. The rest rely on what the industry calls qualities and values. So does the candidate project the image of a strong leader, kind of guy you'd like to meet in a bar, or somebody who cares about you and is just like you? My guess, I have no evidence, but I'm just guessing, is that Bush is very carefully trained to say things like nuclear and misunderestimate and all the other silliness that intellectuals like to ridicule. That's probably about as real as the ranch that was constructed for him and the rest of the whole folksy manner. After all, it would hardly do to present him as a spoiled frat boy from Yale who became rich and powerful because he has rich and powerful connections and family. Rather, the imagery projected has to be a guy just like us, not one of these fancy types, a guy who'll protect us, who cares about us, who shares about our moral values. That's the imagery, which is about as real as in toothpaste ads. Not surprisingly, it's done by the same people. Bush, in that case, the point is to undermine markets. In this case, the point is to undermine democracy. It's the same principle. Bush, if you look, received a large majority among voters who said that they were concerned primarily with moral values and terrorism. Now, as for Bush's moral values, there's an easy way to find out what they are. Read the business press the day after the election. It describes what I call the euphoria in corporate boardrooms and so on. That's not because CEOs are opposed to gay marriage. Actually, most of them are what are called liberals. I mean, their social values are about the same as, Canadian dimension, probably. If you want to learn more about their moral value, the Bush moral values, just observe the principle, basic principle, which is not concealed. The principle is that costs are to be transferred to your children and your grandchildren. Now, that's environmental costs, fiscal costs, and the rest. It's not concealed. And those are indeed the moral values. The point of the PR industry is to prevent you from seeing anything as obvious as that. What about terror? Well, the fact of the matter is that Bush's planners escalated the threat of terror, and pretty consciously. It had been predicted, even by their own intelligence agencies, that would be the consequence of the war in Iraq, and it turned out to be true. And they did it because it's just not a high priority for them. Surely as compared with much more serious goals, such as establishing secure military bases in a dependent client state right at the heart of the world's energy resources. That's really important. It's critically important to ensure that the huge profits, one historian of the industry calls them profits beyond the dream of avarice, it's important to ensure that they go into the right pockets. Even meaning U.S. energy corporations, and in fact, much more than that, the U.S. Treasury, high-tech industry, which sells weapons and so on, construction corporations and so on, Bechtel and the rest of them. And even more important than ensuring that the huge profits beyond the dream of avarice go to the right place, certainly not to the people of the region, that's out of the question, but not to competitors either, mostly to the U.S. Much more important than that is what was called the stupendous strategic importance of the Middle East region back 60 years ago, and has been understood ever since. Namely, having a hand on the spigot guarantees what planners 50 years ago called veto power over others. It's George Kennan, favorited, of course. Just his successor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, wrote a couple of months ago that controlling Iraq gives the United States critical leverage over European and Asian economies. Veto power, in other words. And controlling those rivals has been a major concern of policy planners ever since the Second World War. They are, to quote Henry Kissinger, they're supposed to keep to their regional responsibilities within the overall framework of order managed by the United States. That's what Kissinger instructed Europeans in his Year of Europe address 30 years ago. And sometimes they get out of line, so if so, you can use the critical leverage. That's now much more urgent than it was in the past, as they keep threatening to move in an independent course, maybe even united. So the European Union and China have became each other's leading trading partners last year, and these ties are becoming even tighter. And now it of course includes the world's second largest economy, Japan. So critical leverage is more important than ever for world control in what's sometimes called a tripolar world, three major power centers that has been evolving for 40 years and now much more so. In comparison to this, the threat of terror is a pretty minor consideration, although the threat is known to be awesome. Long before 9/11, it was clearly understood, written about in technical publications, that sooner or later the jihadist terror that was organized by the U.S. and its allies in the 1980s is likely to combine with weapons of mass destruction, which could have horrifying consequences, but it's just not a high priority. Those who thought they were voting for somebody who's going to protect them from terror and has their moral values are severely deceived. Well, U.S. public opinion is actually studied with great care and depth, and we know a lot about it. There were major studies released by the most prestigious outfits right before the election, and they showed that people planning to vote for Bush assumed that the Republican Party shared their views, even though the party explicitly rejected them, as was shown. And pretty much the same is true of Kerry supporters. It's modified slightly if you give a very sympathetic interpretation of occasional vague statements that most voters had probably never even heard. The major concerns of Kerry supporters were the economy and health care, and they assumed, falsely as it turns out, that he shared their views on these matters, just as Bush voters assumed, falsely, that the Republicans shared their views. So, summarize all this, among those who bothered to vote, they mostly accepted the imagery that was concocted by the PR industry, just as in the non-existent markets that were taught about in economics courses. And the imagery had only the vaguest resemblance to reality. That's, of course, apart from the more wealthy, who do tend to vote their class interests, apparently even more so in 2004 than 2000, which probably accounts for most of the small difference between these 2 years. Well, what about actual public attitudes? That's crucially important, especially for those who want to change the world. Well, again, right before the election, October, major studies were released reporting public attitudes in the United States. The majority believes that the United States should abandon the Security Council veto and follow UN decisions even if it doesn't approve of them. Majority, again, believe that that the U.S. should rely on diplomatic and economic measures more than military ones in the so-called war on terror. And here's a crucial one: the U.S. should use force only if, I'm quoting, there is strong evidence that the country is in imminent danger of being attacked. That means a large majority reject the bipartisan consensus on so-called preemptive war and adopt a rather conventional interpretation of the UN Charter. Overwhelming majorities of the public favor the expansion of purely domestic programs, primarily health care, it's 80%, but also expanded aid to education and expanding Social Security, also like 60, 70%. That's been found for years in the same studies carried out by the most reputable organizations that monitor public opinion. In other mainstream polls, 80% favor universal health care. That's something that's also been true for a long time. The numbers vary depending on exactly how the questions are asked. Occasionally the press discusses this. It says, yeah, everybody seems to want it, but there's a phrase for it. It's called politically impossible. That's why the New York Times describes how the New York Times has described it in the past. Just again, a couple of days before the election, the New York Times had an article on this, and here's what it said. It says, there is so little political support for government intervention in the healthcare market in the United States. That's not universal health care, but any government intervention in the healthcare market. There's so little political support for it that John Kerry took pains in a recent presidential debate to say that his plan for expanding access to health insurance would not create a new government program. That is what the large majority of the population want. But it's politically impossible, and that's correct. It's opposed by the insurance companies, the pharmaceutical industry, and Wall Street, so it's therefore politically impossible in a country where the elite doesn't not only doesn't pretend that it's a democracy, but doesn't want it to be. So like if 80% of the population wants something, it's politically impossible and has no political support if it's not supported in the places that matter. Well, I could go on with these studies, which are quite interesting, but one interesting thing about them is that they are held by people in virtual isolation. They rarely hear them. They probably regard them as idiosyncratic, like I'm the only person in the country who thinks this. They don't enter into political campaigns. They only enter very marginally into articulate opinion in the media and journals, and the same extends to other domains. And it raises quite important questions about what we call a democratic deficit when we're talking about others. Some of these cases are very revealing. So you remember that last March, Spanish voters voted out a government which had gone to war in opposition to about 90% of the population. Well, when the Spanish government did go to war, joining the U.S. over huge, almost universal objection, it was very highly praised in the United States and Britain and much of the West, because it was described, as you remember, what was called the New Europe, the hope for the future, the hope for democracy, namely countries that, if you look at the criterion that distinguished the good guys, New Europe, from the bad guys, Old Europe, it was very straightforward, almost impossible to miss. It took real dedication to the party line to miss it, and it was universally missed almost. The criterion was if a government takes the same position as the overwhelming majority of the population, it's Old Europe, the bad guys, as it doesn't have democratic credentials. That was the term that was actually used. On the other hand, if the government follows the orders from Crawford, Texas, and overrules the vast majority of the population, around 90% in Spain's case, then it's the hope for the democratic future. It tells you a lot about the conception of democracy. Well, last March, Spanish voters voted out that government, and they were bitterly condemned for appeasing terror, and you remember all of that. I didn't see anybody point out that the voters in Spain took almost exactly the same position as about 70% of Americans south of the border. About 70% of people in the United States were in favor of what I just said, transferring authority for reconstruction, security, political transfer in Iraq to the United Nations. In fact, that had been true for about a year at that time. And that's what the Spanish voters voted for. They didn't vote for pulling out the troops. They said leaving them there only under UN authority. Well, there's a difference between Spain and the United States. In Spain, people knew what public opinion was. In the United States, to find it out, you got to do a research project. It's there, but you got to do some work. And in Spain, people could vote for it. In the United States, completely off the electoral agenda. It's really important to keep issues out of the electoral agenda because of popular attitudes. Actually, we could ask, what would the result be if the parties, let's say either of them, had been willing to articulate people's concerns, even on the issues that people pick as most important? Or what would happen if such issues were allowed to enter mainstream discussion? Well, about that we can only speculate, but we do know that it doesn't happen and that the facts are barely even reported. And it seems reasonable to surmise that it's fear of the great beast that lies behind that, and it's pretty deep. Well, the operative conception of democracy is also revealed very clearly in the international arena, as in the case I mentioned and others. Let's take a current case, the death of Yasser Arafat. The lead think piece in the New York Times by their kind of house lefty intellectual on the death of Arafat, the lead story think piece opened by saying this: the post-Arafat era will be the latest test of a quintessentially American article of faith, that elections provide legitimacy even to the frailest institutions. read down to the last paragraph on the continuation page, and you read, Washington resisted new national elections among the Palestinians because Arafat would win and gain a fresher mandate, and they might help give credibility and authority to other people the U.S. doesn't like. In other words, democracy is fine if you're sure that the results are going to come out the right way. That's the quintessential faith. And we see that very dramatically right now in the case of Iraq, very dramatically. A year ago, after all the other pretexts had collapsed, Bush's speechwriters came along with a new one to replace them. It's what the liberal press calls the president's messianic vision to bring democracy to Iraq, Middle East, whole world. And the reactions were kind of intriguing. They ranged from rapturous acclaim in the liberal national press, from praise for the, it ranged from there to critics. The critics agreed that the vision was noble and inspiring, but they said it might be beyond their reach. The problem is that Iraqi culture is just not ready for such progress towards civilized values. But it was interesting that it was presupposed across the spectrum that this was the goal of the invasion. Well, there's evidence for that, one piece of evidence. Our leader proclaimed it. What more is needed? The critics say noble vision, but we have to temper the messianic idealism of Bush and Blair with sober realism. Now, that's the London Financial Times, probably the most serious newspaper in the world. Well, actually there is, you can tell me what the Canadian press said. I'll make a guess, but you can verify it for me. Well, there actually was one sector of opinion that had a different view, Iraqis. At the very same time as the messianic vision was proclaimed in Washington to reverent applause, there was a U.S.-run poll in Baghdad, and it turned out that some people there also believed that that was the goal of the invasion, 1%. A majority of the population took the obvious view. The U.S. invaded Iraq to get control of its resources and to organize the region in U.S. interests. The view you're not allowed to express in the United States, or you're a conspiracy theorist or a Marxist or some other bad word. In fact, Iraqis agree that there's a problem of cultural backwardness that stands in the way of the messianic vision, but they think it's here, not in Iraq. Actually, their views are a little more nuanced if you look. So 1% thought the U.S. invaded to establish democracy, but 50% said the U.S. wants democracy in Iraq. Now, that may look like a contradiction until you go on. 50% said the U.S. wants democracy, but is going to influence it to ensure that it comes out the right way. In other words, they understand very well the quintessentially American faith, perhaps because it was also the quintessentially British faith, while Britain's boot was on their neck since the First World War. And they don't have to know the history of Wilsonian idealism, as it's called, or Britain's noble counterpart, or the French civilizing mission, or the even more exalted vision of Japanese fascists and many others. It's presumably close to a historical universal. Their own experience is enough. And it's not unusual for those at the wrong end of the club to have a much clearer picture of reality than those who are wielding it. That's true in plenty of domains. Well, at the outset, I mentioned very briefly the very notable successes of popular struggles in the past decades. It's pretty clear if you think about it a little, very rarely discussed for reasons that aren't hard to discern. Both recent history and public attitudes suggest some pretty straightforward and quite conservative strategies for short-term activism on the part of those who don't want to wait for China to save us from ultimate doom. We do enjoy great privilege and freedom, in fact, uniquely so by comparative and historical standards. That legacy was not granted as a gift from above. It was won. It was won by hard and dedicated struggle, which doesn't reduce to pushing a lever every few years. we can, of course, decide to abandon the legacy. You can take the easy way of pessimism. You know, everything's hopeless, so I quit. Or we can make use of that legacy and work to create, in part to recreate, the basis for a functioning democratic culture in which the public plays some role in determining policies, and not only in the political arena, from which it's largely excluded, but in the crucial economic arena from which it is excluded in principle. Now, those are not particularly radical ideas. So, for example, they were articulated very clearly by the leading 20th century social philosopher in the United States, John Dewey, who's American as apple pie in the familiar phrase. And he pointed out that until what he called industrial feudalism is replaced by industrial democracy, politics will remain the shadow cast by business over society. Now, Dewey wasn't being particularly original in that. In fact, he was drawing from a long tradition of thought and action that had developed independently in working class culture from the very origins of the Industrial Revolution, actually, right where I live, an area near Boston in the mid-19th century. Those ideas were remain just below the surface, and they can become a living part of our societies and our cultures and our institutions. But like other victories for justice and freedom over the centuries, that's not going to happen by itself. One of the clearest lessons of history, including very recent history, is that rights are not granted. They are won, and the rest of it's up to us. Thanks.
What very, very practical ideas or suggestions you can give us, which we in this hall can take with us as we go out of this hall, to change the trend of governments that is taking us to the precipice of disaster?
I think it's pretty simple. And in fact, I think we all know it. I mean, we have to create, in part recreate, a functioning democratic society in which people's opinions matter, in which people participate and in deciding matters that are important to them, whether it's in the political arena or sooner or later the economic arena. And that's not, it's not something you do every couple of years when there's some personalized electoral, extravaganza going on to divert your attention. That's something you do every day. If you want to build, one of the parts of these efforts is to build electoral alternatives. It's not the whole story. It's one part of them. But that's something you have to be doing every day, at the local level, regional levels, on all kind of issues and so on. When you get enough of that happening, then you get an electoral alternative. And, it's not a very exotic suggestion. And in fact, for us, it's particularly easy. I mean, it happens in other places. Like, say, take the second biggest country in the hemisphere. A couple of years ago, they had a presidential election which was democratic at a level that we can't even dream of. I mean, the population elected a person from their own ranks. Pretty impressive figure. Had no higher education, peasant, union leader, steel worker. And they were able to do it because there were mass popular organizations functioning, not every couple of years when the extravaganza takes place, but constantly. Like, say, the landless workers movement. I'm talking about Brazil. The landless workers movement is probably the most important popular movement in the world. And it's there all the time, undertaking its activities. The Workers' Party has all kind of defects and flaws, but it's a mass popular organization which is working all the time, and you can participate in it. And the same is true of other associations, the unions, professional associations, and others. Well, that's the basis for democratic culture. And it's a lot harder to create in Brazil than here. I mean, they have to face things we don't have to worry about, like a very repressive and violent state. The huge amount of extreme poverty, high levels of illiteracy, the threat from international financial capital, which wants to destroy the country if it goes in that direction. We don't have to face any of those problems. They weren't going to be sent to torture chambers or assassinated and so on and so forth. For us, it's easy. If we don't do it, it's our own fault.
You stated that elections provide legitimacy to even the frailest institutions. Without the legitimacy of legitimate elections, our democratic institutions are frail indeed. I'm sure you would agree with that. So I'm wondering, since there's widespread evidence that the recent election in the United States was stolen by the Republican Party, what do you think it will take for the media, or possibly the Democratic Party, to intervene and recount the vote? And if this proved to be true, that the election was stolen, what would you expect to happen?
Well, first of all, just to remind you, I wasn't the one who said that legitimacy is given to the frailest of institutions by election. That's what the big think piece in the New York Times said, and described as the quintessential American faith, that elections, but as they pointed out, maybe inadvertently in the same article, that's not the quintessential American faith. The quintessential faith, you read the last paragraph, is that elections give legitimacy if they come out the right way, otherwise not. So that wasn't me, that was the New York Times. About the, there's kind of an industry developing now trying to show that the election was stolen in the United States. And a lot of my friends are involved and close associates and so on. I think they're being seriously misled. For the reasons that I mentioned, the elections in the United States had about as much significance as flipping a coin to pick the king, because issues were kept out and the public was kept out. Now, if it turns out that you're flipping a coin and the coin was a little bit biased, it's not nice, but it's not the problem. I mean, the problem is whether if the coin had been, say, biased the other way, and Kerry was in the White House, it doesn't tell you anything more about the country. The elections are still illegitimate.
So there's no difference if Gore had won the election in 2000?
There'd
we would
be
still
different.
be exactly the same place we are today, sir?
No, there are different policies, but you flip a coin for two kings, they may carry out different policies too.
I would say that Bush is acting like a king. I don't think Kerry would be doing the same thing. I disagree.
That's traditional. So, for example, did the population vote for the Clinton doctrine, which says that we have the right to use force unilaterally to preserve access to markets and resources? No, in fact, the public's overwhelmingly opposed to that. And so on down the line. You take a look at public attitudes, they are so far to what we call the left of both parties that they can't even be reported, let alone enter into the discussion or elections. And that tells us that the elections, yes, parties differ, as two kings may be different, but that's not the issue. The issue, it is an issue, but a minor one. The real issue is, can we create a functioning democratic society? So we don't have to wait for China to save us from ultimate doom, for example.
I wanted to ask you about the political definition of totalitarianism and how closely it can currently relate to the situation in the States. And I'm talking about the sense of alienation that a lot of people have when they have no time to get together or feel a sense of community, and the Patriot Act, which I think is quite similar to the fire decrees of Germany, 1933.
Look, let's talk about both of those things. The Patriot Act is a bad thing, okay? But, let's look at it in context. Bad as it is, it doesn't come even close to what Woodrow Wilson did, what's called Wilsonian idealism, which just crushed the labor movement, independent thought, kicked thousands of people out of the country and so on, and really pretty much silenced the country for 10 years. In fact, it doesn't come close to what the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations did. Not that far back, what was called COINTELPRO, the programs carried out by the National Political Police, the FBI, under presidential direction, which were aimed at really seriously silencing discussion and criticism all across the board. It started, of course, with the Communist Party, went to the Puerto Rican Independence Party, went on to without going through the steps, ended up with the women's movement, the New Left, everything had to be stopped. Those programs went as far as political assassination, Gestapo-style assassination, literally, in Chicago in 1969, and many other things. Well, compared with that, the Patriot Act is a cup of tea. You know, it's a problem if you have to survive assassination attempts, or if you're going to be thrown into a torture chamber or something like that. We don't have those problems. The Patriot Act is unpleasant, and we can get rid of it, but we should put it in context, even in historical context. And the same is true of the notion of totalitarianism. We do not live in totalitarian societies. We live in remarkably free societies. In fact, there's no historical analog to them. There's no comparative analog. And that was one, and we shouldn't give it up, and we shouldn't describe it as totalitarian. Take a look at the extraordinary freedom that we have. We do, and it wasn't given by anyone. You know, that was won, and it was hard to win. I mean, take recent things, like, say, women's rights. Okay, by now, a lot of women's rights are just taken for granted. Doesn't go back very far. If you had asked my grandmother if she was oppressed, she wouldn't have even known what you're talking about. If you had asked my mother whether she was oppressed, she would have understood it and resented it, but she didn't imagine you could do anything about it. If you ask my daughter whether she's oppressed, she'll kick you out of the house. You know? Okay, those things have been won, and they're now largely taken for granted. And that's changed the societies. And it didn't happen by itself. And that's going to be the same at anything you look at. And we should not forget that we have those rights because people fought for them.
Professor Chomsky, one of the, you mention obviously all the time about omissions in the mainstream press. One of the main omissions that I am constantly aware of is a discussion about the fact that Israel is a nuclear superpower in the Middle Eastern context. Yeah. And when I read about the Iranian government trying to develop nuclear weapons, and I think about the history of the Iraqi government trying to develop nuclear weapons, I often wonder if that isn't caused by attempts to sort of rectify the imbalance in power that's created there. Anyway, I just want to know what your impression is about that particular issue.
Well, I should tell you that you're not the only one who's concerned about Israeli nuclear weapons. Israeli strategic analysts are too. If you read what they write, they say that Israel's nuclear weapons are very dangerous, not only to the region, but to Israel, because they're going to call forth, naturally, reactions. Just like the Bush transformation of the military, which Canada is participating in, missile defense and stuff. It's called missile defense. It's really an offensive weapon. And everybody knows it. Yeah, that calls forth reactions. And you can read the same from the former chair, of the U.S. Strategic Command under Clinton. You know, you can't talk when you're in there, but they can talk after they leave. General Lee Butler, who describes Israeli nuclear weapons as what he calls dangerous in the extreme, not only in themselves, but because they lead to proliferation in reaction. But look, Israel is a small part of this. I mean, there's something, you know, nobody wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, me either. But there's something kind of grotesque about the fact that the United States and Europe, which are in gross violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, particularly the United States, are condemning Iran because it's observing the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, what Iran is being charged with now happens to be in accord with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Okay, they shouldn't be doing it, you know, should stop it, it'd be stopped somehow. But I mean, the U.S. and all the nuclear powers are in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was founded on the principle, it's one of the articles of the treaty, that the nuclear powers will make what are called good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. See anybody doing it? In fact, the U.S. is creating new nuclear weapons. That's the most serious violation. So yeah, there's something kind of grotesque about this. And if you were in Iran, just put yourself in the position of an Iranian strategic analyst, you know, trying to figure out how to defend the country. I mean, the country is essentially under attack by the global superpower in every possible way, economic, you know, they're worried it'll go beyond. The neighboring countries are under military occupation by their superpower enemy. Okay, there are nuclear weapons right nearby, like in Pakistan, the regional superpower, as you say. Israel is virtually an offshore U.S. military base. Furthermore, they know, even if it's not reported here, they know what's reported in the Israeli press and the military journals, namely that for the last year or so, the U.S. has been sending Israel, its offshore military base, over 100 of its most advanced jet bombers, openly described, in fact, as publicly as possible, as capable of bombing Iran and returning, and equipped with what the Hebrew press calls special weapons, whatever that's supposed to mean, but Iranian analysts will make a worst-case analysis of it. And they also know the estimates of the Israeli military, even a couple of years ago, that their air and armored forces are now already then, before this buildup, more powerful than any NATO power outside the United States, bigger and more extensive, not because Israel's a powerful state, it's a tiny little country, but because it's an offshoot of the Pentagon in many respects and a base. Well, they know all those things. Now, how do you expect them to react? In fact, it's possible that a good deal of this is an effort to provoke them into doing something that will be a pretext for an attack. I mean, they shouldn't be doing it, and it's very dangerous for the world if they do. In fact, the existence of nuclear weapons is a horrendous danger. It's come very close to destroying the world several times, very close. I mean, literally within minutes. In fact, back at the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world was literally about one word away from destruction. It wasn't known at the time, but it's now known at the peak of the missile crisis, which was provoked by Kennedy's terrorist operations against Cuba to a large extent. Big international terrorist operations. Anyhow, the missile crisis came along. Right at the peak of it, the tensest moment, the U.S. was imposing a quarantine around Cuba. And there were Russian ships approaching. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And they were accompanied by Russian submarines. And we now know, it was not known then, that those submarines had nuclear-tipped missiles. And at one point, the submarines came under attack by U.S. destroyers. And the commanders had to make a decision. Is a nuclear war going on? If so, we've got to fire our nuclear-armed missiles. And they have command authority, probably similar to the U.S. and Britain at that level. The Russian rules of engagement were that 3 commanders had to authorize using nuclear-tipped missiles, and 2 agreed, and 1 said no. Vasily Arkhipov, his name is. You ought to have about 50 Nobel Peace Prizes. So they didn't use them. And if they had used them, the U.S. would surely have retaliated. And, then it goes on kind of like automatically up to what Eisenhower had called the destruction of the Northern Hemisphere. And that's not the only time that we were that close. I mean, the current militarization of space programs, like what's ridiculously called missile defense, first strike weapon, as everyone knows, those systems are compelling the Russians, and pretty soon the Chinese, to build up offensive nuclear forces. Russian military expenditures probably tripled during the Bush years, to build up offensive military weaponry of new and more sophisticated kinds, which is on hair-trigger alert, means under automated control, computer control. Well, those systems just don't work. U.S. systems, which are far more sophisticated, give a huge number of false messages. And then there's a couple of minutes for human intervention, literally a few minutes for human intervention, and so far it's always stopped the programmed response. Well, the Russian systems are deteriorating. They're nowhere near as sophisticated. And we're forcing them to put us under extreme risk of destruction. That's you can read about it in the best places, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, anywhere you like. In fact, the huge U.S. military buildup, this is the reason why these strategic analysts are talking about ultimate doom and hoping China will stop it. The U.S. Expansion of military forces, including so-called missile defense, is compelling the Russians, who are way behind militarily, to transfer nuclear missiles around the country, like from Vladivostok to the west, to counter the overwhelming preponderance of military weaponry that they're facing. Well, you know, those missiles are going by railroad trains. It wouldn't take a very sophisticated terrorist to stop them and take them. And we're kind of asking for that. You know, we're kind of asking for that to happen by the transformation of the military. Yeah, so Israel's military weapons are certainly threatening, but, you know, we got things much more close to home to worry about.
I'd like you to predict, although you added that Iran is sort of endangered by the Afghanistan and Iraq being occupied by Americans, I'd just like to add that it's also occupied by a fundamentalist group of religious clerics who are duplicate of Bush. But I just want to know, as an Iranian myself, how do you predict the scene? Do you think this nuclear, the whole issue would become another excuse for an intervention to Iran, or since there's a lot of anxiety among Iranians?
Look, my predictions are no better than yours. And in fact, the people in the Pentagon can't predict it. You really can't predict. There's a lot of options. Some of them might happen. What we ought to be doing is acting to lower the threat of the worst options. There's not a lot of point speculating about this. My own speculation, for the very little that it's worth, and don't pay any attention to it, is that the chance of a U.S. attack against Iran have been much reduced by the extraordinary failure of the military occupation in Iraq. I mean, that should have been one of the easiest military occupations in history. My guess was that, you know, that the war, so-called, would be over in about 3 days, and after that, there'd be no problem running the country. But in fact, what's happened, and this is astonishing, is that the U.S. and Britain are having way more trouble than the Nazis had in occupied Europe. And they were in the midst of a war. But if you go back to, say, Vichy and Norway and Denmark and so on, under Nazi occupation, I mean, they were run by domestic governments and domestic security forces. I mean, the German army was in the background if anything went wrong. But they didn't run it. It was mostly run by the local authorities, who had plenty of political support, you know, under the collaborationist. I mean, now we condemn them, you know, collaborationist governments, but they regard as pretty legitimate by most of the populations. Same with the Russians in Eastern Europe. I mean, those countries were basically run by Russia, just like the Middle East was run by Britain. But they had their own governments, their own security forces. They did almost everything. If anything totally got out of hand, like in Hungary or Czechoslovakia, the Russian army would move in, but not much trouble. Nothing like what the U.S. and Britain have succeeded in stirring up in Iraq, which is totally unexpected. Nobody could have predicted that. And it happened, and I think that's kind of clipped their wings. I think it's the Weekend Review of the Times, I don't remember. The kind of big story about how the hawks in Washington, there aren't, you know, some nice headline, which I forget, about how, you know, the hawks in Washington aren't flying the way you think they are. Well, that's probably true, because they've run into so much trouble that they've got to back off. So, you know, speculation, not worth much, is they're not going to carry out the activities that they were planning. Like I'd suspected, my own guess back before they were right at the eve of the Iraq War, was that it would work like a dream, well, kind of like the Nazis in Europe. And then the next place they'd attack would be the Andes. I mean, the whole Andean region, from Venezuela down to Argentina, it's not more than Andean, from Venezuela down to Argentina is out of control. You know, all kind of things are happening that the U.S. doesn't want. And that's the historic region that you got to control. It's also a region of that the U.S. is counting on for resources, including oil, just as it's counting on Canada. Though Canada is now more or less under control thanks to NAFTA. Remember, one crucial part of NAFTA is that Canada can't use its own resources as it chooses. The U.S. has to have what's called equal access to them, but, you know, a giant and a, what was the term, an elephant and a moose or something. You know, the elephant gets what it wants. But the Andean region, in fact, that whole region from Venezuela down, is considered a major potential resource, oil and other things. The U.S. has military forces all over the place, more than during the Cold War. Military training and aid is shooting way up. And that looked like a place that there might be there are bases all over the place, new military bases. I mean, it looked like that could be a next target of intervention, but now I don't think it's so likely. They've got too much trouble on their hands.